tonight to host the launch of Juliette Fay's latest novel, City of Flickering Light, about which best-selling author B.A. Shapiro raves. City of Flickering Light is a delight of a novel, full of fascinating characters, timely themes, heady ups and downs, and all set in Hollywood during the era of silent films, a fabulous read. For any of you who do not already know her, Wayland resident Juliette is the author of the USA Today bestseller, The Tumbling Turner Sisters, chosen as a Costco Penny's Book Club pick in 2017. Her previous novels include The Shortest Way Home, one of Library Journal's top 5 best women's fiction books of 2012, Deep Down True, shortlisted for the Women's Fiction Award by the American Library Association, and Shelter Me, 2009 Massachusetts Book Award must-read book and Indie Next Pick. Tonight, Juliette will speak for about 25 minutes. We'll have some time for questions, and then she'll be available to sign books. One quick plug for the library is embarking on a strategic planning process, and we would love your input. We have a brief 13-question survey available online or on paper through the month of April, and you can find a link on our website, or I have these little reminder cards. Your feedback is crucial to our process. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to Juliette for sharing her work with us, and please enjoy.
Okay, so I am going to use this stand because I've got a clicker. I've got too many things to hold on to, but let me know if you can't hear me, okay? So first of all, I just want to thank the Wayland Library for hosting me here tonight in this beautiful room. It's just, I feel so grateful to have all of you here. Courtney Michael spread the word. She's the events coordinator for the Wayland Library. Spread the word like crazy. And Sandy Raymond was also incredibly helpful. She's the director. Getting all the furniture out of this place so all you wonderful people can be in it. I want to send a little shout out to my treats makers, Barb Fletcher, Julie Murtaugh, and Linda Dacey. So please go over and have a little something. And I want to thank all of you for being here because there's really nothing like a hometown crowd. So thank you very much. There are seats over here if people want to sneak over and come sit. I don't want anybody to feel like they have to stand. Don't be shy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to write The City of Flickering Light, the facts and the real stories behind the story. And then, as Courtney said, we will just go to questions. And any questions you want to ask, I know somebody's going to want to ask how they can get a sparkly, spangly dress like this. And I will answer that question. So first of all, I have to say that I stumbled onto the silent movie era with a little bit of an attitude. I was doing research for my previous book, The Tumbling Turner Sisters, which is about a family that goes into vaudeville in 1919 and travels from town to town. Vaudeville was the country's main form of entertainment from the 1880s through the 1920s. And it was basically a variety show. Anything that was entertaining, singers, dancers, contortionists, animal tricks, regurgitators, I'm not kidding, anything that was remotely entertaining. So I did so much research on vaudeville and came to love it so wholeheartedly that I was honestly quite ticked off when it died. And that happened long before I was born, so it was like anger from a previous life, but I was still really mad. So one of the biggest reasons that vaudeville died was because of the silent movies. Silent movies also were sort of picking up steam around 1900, and they went through toward the end of the 1920s. The first movie with synchronized sound that was nationally distributed was The Jazz Singer in 1927. And after that, very quickly, movies moved to talkies, which they were not called at the time. So silent movies, come on, they're silent. They're sort of silly, and the acting is hammy. Oops, there's vaudeville. Okay. So this, you know, they don't have words. And I'm a person who likes words, as you can probably imagine. This is 1921, The Chic. That's Rudolph Valentino and Agnes Ayres. This is the movie that put Rudolph Valentino on the map and into the minds and fantasies of women across the nation. So anyway, I'm on the internet doing, you know, serious writerly research, you know, vaudeville. And then, you know, you're flipping around and you see something, you know, 1920s fashion. And who's that? It's Colleen Moore, silent movie star. Clickety, clickety, click. You're right down the rabbit hole. So here's what turned my retroactive fury about the silent movie industry killing vaudeville into my interest in maybe pursuing it and writing a book about it. And that was really the fact that no one was really paying attention to the movies. So here is an incredibly simplified and selective history of the early movie industry. And around the 1880s, several companies were making cameras. One of them was the Gaumont French company, and there was a secretary there by the name of Elise Guy Blanchet, who it appears is the first person in the history of the world to say, hey, instead of just taking pictures of like a galloping horse or people walking out of a factory, why don't we use this little gadget to tell a story in order to get people to want to buy it? And her boss said to her, oh, maybe, go ahead and give it a try, but don't let it interfere with your secretarial duties. So that's Elise. Elise Elise cooked up this 1-minute film called The Cabbage Fairy. And the beautiful simplicity of The Cabbage Fairy is that it consists solely of a woman dressed up like a fairy pulling live naked babies out of fake cabbages. That's it. That's pretty much the movie right there. And Elise then went on to produce 400 more films. She moved to America and set up her own studio, and by the end of her career had produced 1,000 films.
Wow.
Meanwhile, back in the United States, Thomas Edison had patented the kinetograph, which was another kind of movie camera. He did not invent it. He hired guys that invented it, but he was the patenter, and he was a super shrewd business guy. And so he set up this trust of companies. And he said to this trust of companies, only you guys can use my patents and my cameras. This turned out to be illegal, by the way, no surprise. And anybody else who uses them, you know, no one else is allowed to use them. And then he hired thugs. He literally hired guys to go out and find these independent filmmakers while they were filming and break their cameras. Oh, yeah. So, and then the industry was centered on the East Coast, predominantly in New York and New Jersey. So that's Thomas Edison. Meanwhile, in California, it's just so sunny and temperate. And the movies are really hard to make in rain and blizzards. It also cost Thomas Edison a lot more money to send his thugs to California and break cameras than to, for instance, Fort Lee, New Jersey. So he doesn't very often. So incredibly simplified and selective history of Hollywood. Hollywood was inhabited by native people called the Gabrielinos. They didn't call themselves that, but that's what we call them. Then a couple of farmers moved in, and they called it Cahuenga Valley. And then Harvey and Dieta Wilcox came from Ohio. This is their plot. They came from Ohio, and they bought up 160 acres, and they renamed it Hollywood because Dieta had a friend whose house was named Hollywood, and she liked the name. And their idea was that Hollywood would become an alcohol-free Christian utopia. I am not kidding about that. I just laughed so hard when I heard that. They gave free lots to Christian churches, and they wanted it to be a bastion of temperance, piety, and propriety Boy, did that not work out. So here's what it looked like in 1896. Okay, so this is facing north. That's the Santa Monica hills in the background. And this is Hollywood Boulevard, right across the front. Okay, it was originally called Prospect Boulevard. But that's what it looked like. And then, so remember Thomas Edison and rain. Filmmakers started figuring out that safety in sun was kind of a good deal. So famed director D.W. Griffith filmed the first one-reeler, 15 minutes, called In Old California in Hollywood. That's the first movie known to have been filmed in Hollywood. And the next year, 1911, the Nestor Film Company came and set up shop on the dusty crossroads of Sunset Boulevard and Gower, which is still a place where there's a lot of movie studios, and many, many soon followed. So in 1923, 27 years later, same perspective. Okay, so you see the Hollywood land sign in the background. That was supposed to be a temporary advertisement for real estate, plot of land. It was supposed to come down in 18 months. It didn't. And it sort of fell into disrepair, and then I think the city of Los Angeles bought it, and they have a park up there. They refurbished it. They took off land because that was associated with the development, and Hollywood was Hollywood, right? So back to why nobody taking the movies seriously was, other than the filmmakers, was so important. In those early years, flickers, which they were called because of the way the projection flickered, they were considered fluff. One reel, 15 minutes. They were used as filler for vaudeville shows. You could actually watch about an hour of them for a nickel at the aptly named Nickelodeon. And these were rustic little theaters. My husband is working. Phone call, Tom? They were rustic little theaters, mostly patronized by poor people who couldn't afford the 25 cents to go to a vaudeville show, or substantially more to go to a legitimate theater. So even as these one-reelers were growing into 2 and 5 and 10-reelers, and directors like Cecil B. DeMille and Lois Weber, more on her later, were really perfecting the craft of filmmaking. Up until about 1925, flickers were not considered terribly respectable. So if you could get a job in a mainstream employment, you tended to avoid a career in these, revolving around these flights of fancy. If, however, you were shut out of mainstream employment because of your gender or your religion, Hollywood beckoned. So each chapter of the book starts with a quote from a movie star or a filmmaker, except one. Chapter 1 starts with a quote from preeminent Hollywood historian Carrie Beauchamp, and it really was the thing that sort of got me started on thinking about this book. Hollywood was built by women and Jews. Those people were not allowed in respectable professions. It was not taken seriously as a business, so women and Jews could get into it. So here are a few fun facts that really grabbed my attention as I was starting to warm to the idea of silent movies. Women worked in virtually every job in the industry, from plasterer molder, which was set construction, to studio chief. There were a few popular actors, but actresses were the stars. America's sweetheart, Mary Pickford, was consistently one of the highest paid actors, male or female, throughout the teens and 20s. She was recently named by the American Film Institute as 24th on the list of greatest all-time actresses. But wait, there's more. Mary Pickford, along with Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, and her husband Douglas Fairbanks, started United Artists Studio, which is still operating today. And it was widely known and accepted that Mary was the smartest of all of them, and she was the one who was really keeping track of the business details and that kind of thing. In 1916, the highest paid The highest salaried director, male or female, earning an unprecedented $5,000 a week, was Lois Weber. She was as well known in her time as D.W. Griffith or Cecil B. DeMille, and she pioneered film techniques like the split screen and the mirror shot. By comparison, in 2018, of the 100 top grossing films, women directed 4. An estimated half of all screenplays produced before 1925 were written by women. That's 50%. In 2018, it was 15%. For over 20 years, the most respected, the most sought after, the highest paid screenwriter, male or female, was Frances Marion, who is really hard to beat by today's standards, by any standard of output and success. She is the only woman to have won 2 Academy Awards for Best Screenplay, 1930's The Big House and 1931's The Champ, starring a very young Jackie Cooper. So why did women's influence start to wane in the mid-20s? You are asking yourselves right now, right? You're starting to be saying, why are we still not? And the reason is because films got better, they got more widely accepted, wealthier people started going to them, and they started making money. So when the net profits went up, men nudged the women out. And no offense to any of the guys here, I know none of you would ever do this, but back then your gender was a lot less woke. So as for Jews, anti-Semitism was the standard in the early 1900s. And guys like the Warner Brothers and Sam Goldwyn and Irving Thalberg struggled to gain traction in mainstream America. But out in Hollywood, there was no one at the gate keeping them out because there was no gate. What was so interesting about these men was that many of them grew up in poverty. They had a deep sense of their own outsiderness in American society. And in Hollywood, they were the insiders. And they were interpreting and even influencing the American dream through their films. So this is Irving Thalberg and his wife, silent film star Norma Shearer. At age 20, now I know a lot of you, and a lot of you have 20-somethings. At age 20, Irving was the production head for Universal Pictures. How'd you like to say that at a cocktail party, right? He then soon became second in command at MGM, and his films were known for bankability and high quality. And his biographer, Roland Flamini, says his films projected a seductive image of American life brimming with vitality and rooted in democracy and personal freedom. So women and Jews, 2 groups who were so discriminated against at the time in American society, were creating the dreams that America dreamed. So this next quote is a little off topic, but it's my favorite one in the book, so I put it in there. If it isn't for the writing, we've got nothing. Writers are the most important people in Hollywood, and we must never let them know it. It's brilliance of Irving Thalberg. So also in the category of no one paying attention was that in Hollywood, there were very few rules. So keep in mind, the rest of the country was still in this sort of post-Edwardian sense of propriety, right? But out in Hollywood, the stars and the powerful people behind the stars could kind of do as they pleased without consequences as long as they were discreet. So if you lived in Hollywood and you wanted to drink, you were not going to have a problem with that. Even though Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933, Hollywood parties were epic. If you wanted to sleep with someone to whom you were not legally wed, or if you wanted to have a romantic relationship with someone who was either too much like you, as in the same gender, or not enough like you, as in a different race, mum's the word. So William Haynes is one of my favorite examples of this. He was a tall, dark, silent, and openly gay silent film star, very popular. He lived with his boyfriend for 7 years before Louis B. Mayer called him on the carpet and said, "You're not being discreet enough. We need to marry you off." So this was very common. It was called a lavender marriage, and it was often between a gay man and a lesbian woman. And that, you know, it was for the photo ops. They would snuggle for the cameras, and then they would go about their business. You know, they would go on their way. Billy Haynes, however, told Louis B. to go jump in a lake, quit the silent films, became an interior decorator to the stars like his dear friend Joan Crawford, and lived with his beloved for the next 40 years. So you may have heard of the pre-code era in Hollywood, and this was the Motion Picture Production Code, which was instituted in 1930. And so that was just as the silent era was coming to an end. The code was a backlash against the immoral ways of Hollywood and its silent films. So here's a brief passage from City of Flickering Light that I lifted right out of the newspaper at the time, and used it for the story. At the Methodist Church on Hollywood Boulevard, the pastor railed against the film industry as a community of jazzers whose only interest was in eating and drinking and wearing clothes and more clothes and less clothes and more jewels and trying to drive faster and seeking hungrily for fresh sensations and bizarre things. They were moral lepers, lounge lizards, mashing parasites, and lipsticked women. The code had prohibitions on nudity, suggestive dances, superfluous use of liquor, ridicule of religion, lustful kissing, and scenes of passion, among other things. And the reason that the code came to be was precisely because Hollywood and silent movies had plenty of all these things. So one of the movies that I use in the book is The Queen of Sheba. Look carefully. Betty Blythe is the main character, the lead actress, and her costumes were so scant that she said, "I had 28 costumes in that film, and if I'd worn them all at once, I couldn't have kept warm." So Hollywood in the 1920s was one big free-flowing, tolerant party, if you made it. If you didn't make it, or you hadn't made it yet, it could be incredibly free and dangerous. Young women especially came from across the country in droves. They showed up at the train station. They went directly to the studios to sign up as extras. But there were far too many of them to be absorbed into the industry, and some of them were taken advantage of or were forced to unfortunate means of supporting themselves. Drugs and alcohol were also readily available, and one of the things that was so fascinating and disturbing to me to learn about was the history of heroin, which was developed by the Bayer Aspirin Company as a non-addictive derivative of morphine, non-addictive. It was on every drugstore shelf as heroin. I'm going down to the drugstore to get some heroin, honey. It was in cough syrup because heroin suppresses breathing, and if you breathe less, you cough less. It was also in teething syrup, so mothers were rubbing heroin on their babies' gums. By 1914, the addictive nature of heroin, morphine, and cocaine, was readily understood, but you could still get it from a doctor's prescription, and doctors prescribed it. By 1924, the Heroin Act made it illegal entirely, but in Hollywood, you could get anything. So in response to the dire and dangerous circumstances that many of these, especially young women, found themselves in, the Hollywood Studio Club was developed. It was actually a beautiful house. It housed 20 women, which was sort of a drop in the bucket, but better than none. And the patronesses were Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, and Constance DeMille, who was the wife of the famous director, as well as other sort of elite Hollywood types. Girls could stay there. If you were trying to get into the industry, you could stay there for $10.50 a week, and you would get room and board and performance lessons, like acting, dancing, singing, that kind of thing. So, of course, they were overrun with requests for this. In 1926, the YWCA built a building that could house 100 women. And famous residents include Dorothy Malone, Barbara Eden, I Dream of Jeannie, Donna Reed, It's a Wonderful Life, Rita Moreno, West Side Story, and Marilyn Monroe, who apparently posed for nude pictures to make money to make her rent at the club. The Hollywood Studio Club ended its run in 1975, but the building's still there. So, after learning all of this about the industry and watching many, many silent films, I have to admit I really came to enjoy them. True, they had no synchronized sound, and you couldn't hear the actors' voices, but they did have words, intertitles of dialogue and description that was sometimes kind of snappy. Don't mind him, he has an open mind that's temporarily closed for business for repairs. That is from the film The Patsy with Marion Davies. And the films themselves were never silent. They all had music composed for them that was played, on the piano in the theater. Just like today's movies, the scores were written to sort of amp up the emotion at the right places. Some of the stories were pretty basic, but some of them were really complex. For instance, Pandora's Box with Louise Brooks. Some of the acting was pretty hammy, and some of it was surprisingly subtle, like that of Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin. In fact, the first time I saw Mary Pickford's 1917 adaptation of A Little Princess, this is the scene where her father drops her off at an English boarding school and goes back to India and eventually dies. And Mary is waving goodbye and tearfully, I started to cry. I couldn't believe it. Mary Pickford, by the way, was 25 years old when she was playing an 11-year-old. She totally sold it. Can you tell I've really become sort of a Mary Pickford fan? So along with being a pretty wild place with very few rules, where the outsiders were insiders, and the stakes were precipitously high, and they were making great films, they were making great films, and that was a great premise for a book. So, goodbye vaudeville, I'm off to the movies. The City of Flickering Light follows three friends, dancers Irene Van Beck and Millie Martin, and their friend comedian Henry Weiss, as they make their way to Hollywood and try and scale the walls of that incandescent Shangri-La. And along the way they face abuse, sexism, anti-Semitism, and poverty. As much as it's about a fascinating time and a fascinating place, it's really a story about friendship. For those of you who may have read The Tumbling Turner Sisters, there is one sister whose story continues in the City of Flickering Light. I'm not going to tell you who. You can guess if you want to. And I also just want to say that if you're in a book group, I know some of you are, and you choose any of my books, and you're local, like Waylandish, I would be happy to come to your book group and talk about it with you. That's actually kind of fun for me to be able to talk about the end of the story. I Skype with book groups all over the country, so that's kind of fun. Happy to do that. And now, okay, never mind. So now let's do some questions. Who wants to know where I got my dress? Online, of course.
How much did it cost?
It was cheap. I'll tell you afterwards. But it was after Halloween, so I got it on sale. It has black satin gloves, but they're really uncomfortable. So, yes.
It's not a question, but one of the reasons the silent films were successful were that they were being shown to immigrants who couldn't, who weren't speaking English or couldn't understand English. So the exaggerated acting, the nickel to get in, and the lack of, a screenplay in a sense worked for a large immigrant population.
That's really true. And they really tried to make the movies so that you didn't have to read. I mean, there was also a big illiterate population. You didn't really have to read. They also could be distributed in Europe because you didn't have to read English. So it was actually, I mean, why are we not bringing them back? I don't know. Oh, Jane?
Do some of the people you mentioned tonight, do they appear in your book, like Miss Pickford, or are they hidden names? Or?
There are some stars that do appear in the book, and they're sort of peripheral. So it really is about these three characters. But yes, there are some movie stars that do appear in the book.
You've intrigued me. If we want to watch some of these movies, is YouTube the best way to see them?
Yes, absolutely. They're really, you can YouTube anything these days. So what's really sad is that something like 70% of all silent films have been destroyed, because once talkies came in, the studios saw no use for them. A lot of they were made of nitrate film. They went up in flames. So actually, Martin Scorsese and there's other sort of organizations that are trying to save silent films. A lot of them have been lost. For instance, Betty Blythe in the Queen of Sheba. I would have liked to have seen that, but that one's gone. But a lot of them still remain, and you can, Mary Pickford's films, there's a lot of those. There's a lot of Charlie Chaplin, and they're pretty fun. Yeah. Yeah, Karen.
How long did it take you to research this?
Research is like something you do the whole time. I probably did about 3 months of research just to feel like I could get my arms around like what was this thing. And then as you're writing, you absolutely have to like, oh, what was that guy doing? Like that kind of thing. So it was an enormous amount of research. I found it really fun. It's such a wild time that it was really fun to sort of do that research and learn more about the stuff. I know way more about early Hollywood and the silent movies than anybody should know. Like, and it's not all in the book, obviously.
How long did it take you to write this book, and how many hours a week do you commit to it?
So, how many hours a week do I commit to it? So this probably took me about a year to write in fits and starts. And, I am on the I write when I can kind of thing. So right now, while I'm really doing a lot of promotion for City of Flickering Light, like I haven't written, I'm halfway into a new book, but I haven't worked on it in months because I've been doing, so it's sort of like you do what you can. And I'm a firm believer that write every day is a great thing to do if you can, but a lot of people can't. So write when you can. Yeah. Mom.
I just have this question. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
Okay, maybe we'll talk later, Mom.
Is there a tidbit that you learned about the silent film era that you did not put in the book that you could share with us?
Oh my gosh, leave it to your mother to ask her. Yeah, I mean there were plenty of things that I learned about. A lot of sort of the intrigue of the stars and what was going on. There was a lot of shenanigans the stars got into. And one of the things that was so interesting was how easy it was for them to cover this stuff up. So for instance, Clark Gable killed somebody.
Oh my God.
He hit a pedestrian in his car. Studio covered it up. So, how about that? Allison.
Yes, I remember hearing you talk about Tumbling Turner Sisters and adjusting your voice to sort of reflect the time period. So I'm wondering, did you have to adjust again? Was it close enough? Or?
Oh, that's a good question. And it makes sense that you're asking. Allison's a good writer too. One of the things that was great was going from the Tumbling Turner Sisters, 1919, to City of Flickering Light, 1921, kind of the same. So I knew a lot of the sort of jargon and stuff the characters would use. Also sort of that voice of, it's told in third person, But I wanted the reader to sort of have the narrator have a little bit of a feel for what it sounded like back then. So I tried to sort of infuse a little bit of that. But yeah, it made it a lot easier than jumping to like, 1600 or something, which I would never do. Oh my God, that's too hard. Jane.
How do you go from the research that you do to the story? Do you have a good idea? Do you just develop the characters in synergy? How does that?
Yeah, there's a kind of, synergy is a great word for it. What I do is I do a bunch of research and I find out sort of what's my angle? What's the thing that really interests me about this? And what really interested me was how these outsiders were the ones running the industry. And so the three main characters are two women who are former burlesque dancers and a Jewish comedian. And then they go to Hollywood and sort of see what they can do. So that was sort of my starting point. But obviously each character has to have his own backstory and its own reason for why are you here? How did you get where you got? And their relationship really makes a lot of changes over the course of the book. They don't really know each other that well in the beginning. And sort of through this experience of almost combat, in Hollywood, because it was hard, they learn secrets about each other, and so that's the creative part, and then weaving in sort of pieces of Hollywood, what was happening at the time. So there's a murder scandal that I sort of weave in and used as, sort of a plot point for the fictional characters, a real murder scandal that I use as a. So, yeah, thank you, Dahlia.
How much time, did you go to Hollywood?
I did go to Hollywood.
Yeah. And did it get you behind the scenes into special places that like the normal person couldn't go?
Well, a normal person who is willing to just sort of sneak around and like slide in, so one of the places I went was the Egyptian Theater. And that opened in 1922 with Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood. And it has, and it was one of those first places where they really had the red carpet and the star and the premieres and that kind of thing. Lots of big movies premiered there. And so, I snuck in and I looked at it, it's this King Tut design, because King Tut they had just discovered King Tut. So it's this Egyptian design, and it's very cool. So I really did, unfortunately a lot of the buildings from the 1920s have come down, but I was able to sort of get into some things. I had dinner at a place called Musso and Frank, which was there in 1919. It has the original phone booth in Hollywood, the first phone in Hollywood. And Charlie Chaplin had his own booth there. And you just stand in these places and you're like, this is so cool. Do you people know how cool this is? Yes.
If you want to, you may know this, but if you want to see any sound film on large screens, Somerville Theater does a bunch of them. Sometimes the Capitol does. Coolidge Corner does a few a year. Center for Arts and Dating is doing one a quarter. And Jeff Rapsis and Peter Krasinski are two accompanists that travel around in this area. And you can check their websites and I'll tell you where they are. It's really a lot of fun to watch them in that environment. And in a theater, an old theater oftentimes, with an audience.
Right. Can you just come with me to all my events? Yeah, that's true, and I have been to the Somerville Theater and the Coolidge Corner Theater. And it is fun to watch them on the big screen, especially with the accompaniment. The original scores for each of these movies exist. So it is pretty cool, and I encourage you to do that. Yes?
Just curious, did you find any anecdotes or journals of the girls that lived in that big house, Peter Moreno and Monroe?
I didn't.
Were there any accounts,
Right.
Yeah.
That was a sort of a later period than I was interested in. I was really interested in, even before it got to the big place that the Y did with 100 Girls. The time period was more that first house. So I learned as much as I could about it. And there are pictures, and what did writers do before the internet? I have no idea. Because you can just go, let me see the inside of this house that's been torn down, and so it was very interesting. Most of them didn't make it, because very few, like today, very few people make it in the movies. It's a tough industry. Yes?
Could you tell us the story of the cover photo?
Oh, could I tell you the story of the cover photo? How much do I dare tell? Well, this is, oh, actually, I was supposed to be, here, come on. There it is. So originally, there was a photo they gave me, it was beautiful, of these two girls at a country fair, and it was lovely, but it had nothing to do with Hollywood or anything. I was like, what? This is a great picture, but it doesn't go with the book. And then I got another picture that was clearly current day women dressed up as flappers, like with big red lipstick, and and I was like, no, we need a vintage photo. So then they came up with this, and I've actually seen this in the wild. I think it was Getty Images, and this was a photo shoot. These are models. I think they were modeling clothes, and so there's some other shots of them. And then it's actually at the beach. But what they did was they took the Hollywood Hills and put it behind them, because I said, it still doesn't say Hollywood. And it was black and white, and I said, well, I just really think it would be better if it was colorized. So there was a lot of back and forth. My editor called me some names that I was too demanding, but it's like, hey, this book will live and die by its cover. So I am going to poke at you until I get a cover that I think will really sell. So I'm glad I did. And she can think what you want. So. Oh, here we go.
Earlier you were mentioning some of the producers, directors, and you mentioned Chaplin, but only once, and I always thought of him as such a big figure from that period. So does he figure in your book? Is there a reason?
There is a Chaplin sighting in the book. Charlie Chaplin, it's almost hard to put him in because he was this larger-than-life guy, and he got in all kinds of trouble, and he did, and he had a really huge ego, incredible talent. I'm telling you, his movies, like what he could do with his face. You think of silent movies as very hammy, but he would just flick his eyes, or he would just make one little funny little. He just could communicate so much as an actor, and he was an incredibly precise director. He came up with Mack Sennett and the sort of the Keystone Cops and that kind of thing, he was he knew everybody. Then he would get really angry and storm away and that kind of thing. So yeah, I really focused more on sort of the women and Jews aspect, and he's neither. But it's hard to talk about silent films without talking about Charlie Chaplin. Quite a talent. Yeah. Melanie.
What term you said that silent films killed vaudeville, but if they were not considered a classy thing to do originally, what turned the tide between and that from Tumbling Turner Sisters, vaudeville was a little bit better than burlesque.
Right.
And you say you've got burlesque dancers and
Yes, it's all very tangled and complicated. So one of the things that's an interesting thing that you asked, one of the things that happened was Joe Kennedy. So Joe Kennedy, our president's father, spent a lot of time in Hollywood. He loved Hollywood. It is, I think it's pretty well documented that he was having an affair with Gloria Swanson. And he was really a guy who had a lot of money, and he wanted to put money into the movies in the late 20s. And so he had he bought up a lot of vaudeville houses, had them torn down, and put up these movie palaces. There was so much more money in the movies, because think about it, you can film this thing once and then spread it all over the country. And one of the things that was happening was that vaudeville stars are trying to figure out where they fit in this. And so people would say, well, have your act, filmed. And then their act would be filmed, and then it would go, and then nobody would want to see them again. So it was this, very, the entertainment industry has gone through so many changes, and so sort of from live entertainment to, I can go to a movie theater anywhere and see this movie. And then for silent film stars to make that transition into the talkie era, things were happening very quickly, and very few stars could make the jump. George Burns and Gracie Allen, for instance, went from vaudeville to radio to the movies to TV. I mean, George Burns was brilliant, but it was sort of this new fad, and the movies were incredibly realistic. they were getting so much better. At first they were just like silly. And then, so for instance, Birth of a Nation, which is about the post-Civil War, and it's very racist and sort of promoting this idea that the blacks were taking over. You know, D.W. Griffith was this fascinating guy who had such an eye, and he made those films look so realistic that they were believable. So people were believing, because they still were sort of figuring out what's real here, you know? And that's part of what's fun about movies. You go and you pretend that it's real for an hour and a half or whatever. So, yeah, there was a great fascination, and vaudeville went the way of the buggy whip, as they say. Yes?
What was the famous murder that you wove into your book?
Fatty Arbuckle.
Yeah.
He was accused of murder, and so I sort of wove that one in.
That's the.
Yes?
I'm curious if you, if looking into the past gave you any insights into the modern era, maybe some of the outsiders being insiders, or any aspect of the research.
Well, that's such an interesting question, Jenny. And I think there's a way in which there's this constant sort of tumbling of, you know, the people that were out are now in, and the people that are in are now out, and you know, that kind of, you know, sort of wanting what's new. Like, I love that quote from that pastor who's like, seeking hungrily for new sensations, you know? It's sort of the human condition. So, you know, the things that were cool 10 years ago, you know, and the entertainment industry really reflects that. You know, we see it ourselves in what we, you know, what we thought were great movies 20 years ago, and we watch them now. Sometimes though you watch a movie and you're like, oh, what's good about that, you know? So I think that there is something in the human brain that sort of wants that new perspective, that new idea, and we certainly want to fantasize. You know, our brains are made for stories of all varieties, written, you know, film, you know, spoken. So to sort of see that how this medium is being, you know, sort of created and recreated to reflect that sort of, we want stories, but we want those new sensations too. You know, did I answer your question? I sort of rambled for a while then. Yeah. Okay, good. Dahlia?
It can be the last question.
Well,
Any
whatever.
hints on the next book?
Okay, I will tell you. And it is sort of that research thread. So I was researching the silent film, you know, The City of Flickering Light, and the three main characters begin on page 1 jumping off a train in Flagstaff, Arizona, to get away from this brutal burlesque show that they're all, you know, employed by. And so I was researching trains. And what, you know, and I get ridiculously, I own a train schedule in the Southwest from 1922. Because I want to know, when would they have gotten on a train? You people don't care when they got on a train. I'm not going to say, well, 1922 on a Thursday, that train would not have left. This is what writers do. Anyway, so one of the things I learned about were the Harvey Girls. And they were waitresses in the Southwest on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. And waitresses were considered sort of a step above prostitution in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were considered pretty low class, like below domestic help and factory workers. And this guy, Fred Harvey, wanted to develop restaurants, and he was finding that his male waiters were getting liquored up and into fusses with each other. And so he was convinced to hire waitresses, women, and to keep them sort of above reproach, he dressed them almost like nuns. He kept them, he had very strict rules for, you know, how they could, you know, they had to live in dorms, and they couldn't date anybody that the manager didn't say they could, you know, that kind of thing. But in return, they got unprecedented freedom, because they could travel all over the Southwest for free. They could stay at any Harvey house. There was one at every 100 miles. And they could travel without chaperones. They made good money. It was really unprecedented in American society at the time. So all these women flooded in from the East Coast and the Midwest to the Southwest, which was made up of men. The Southwest was like ranchers, railwaymen, prospectors, it was all guys. And suddenly, here are all these young, attractive women coming in serving food, right? And Fred Harvey, the guy who developed Harvey Houses, is credited with populating the Southwest. Because something like half of them stayed and married these, married guys and had something like 6,000 to 8,000 boys were named either Fred or Harvey in a given period of time. Anyway, that's my next thing. So, should we wrap it up here? My husband's giving me the wrap it up sign. And you know me, I do whatever my husband says. I'll be right there, honey. So, thank you all for coming. I want to say one more thing, mostly just to annoy my husband, but I'm just going to say one more thing. And that is because this is a hometown crowd, many of you are my friends. If you read this book and you like it, and you feel like throwing 2 sentences up on Amazon, it makes a huge difference to whether a book gets pushed to more readers. So if you like it and you want to throw up a review on Amazon, it takes a sentence or two, it's really about the stars. If you don't like it, let's just keep that between us.